Hello there. My name is Jonathan Friedman, and you are listening to 5 Facts by EHN Canada. This is a show where we scour the internet for the most frequently asked questions about mental health and addiction and ask an expert for their answers to them. Today, it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce our guest, Danielle Shinbine. Danielle is an incoming PhD student in counseling psychology at the University of Alberta. Their research interests focus on well being of LGBTQ plus individuals throughout the lifespan, with a particular focus on older adults. Danielle, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about you?
Everything is great. People are going to be listening to this whenever they listen to it, but for us today is Friday, and that feels really really nice.
Yes, it's definitely a feel good Friday. It's been a long week and I'm excited for that weekend.
Let's get it. Before we jump into our official 5 questions, of all the spaces in the world, why did you choose counseling psychology?
Yeah, definitely. So to give a little context of where I've been, I've kind of hopped around a bit. So I started at Vancouver Island University with a major in psychology. And from there, I really thought I was going to go the clinical route. And then over time, I began to get more hands on experience. I worked in a group home and I found that some of the values, especially the emphasis on diversity and equality with clients and that kind of thing, I really jived more with the counseling psychology space. And then once I started working with clients, I was like, yeah, this is my fit. I appreciate how therapy is conceptualized and I love doing my clinical work and my research. So it was just a perfect fit there.
That's amazing. And like working in a group home, and were you were was your role in that group home as like a counselor? Like, what did you do there?
So that work was more just doing support work with my clients. So I had four of them and basically helping them with their day to day activities, but also with their larger goals. So for some of them, it was to do a certain task, like to go swimming once a week or something. And that was a part of their personal growth. And I think it was from there that I was like, I really like helping people develop and achieve their goals. And then it kind of naturally slid into doing counseling work.
Super interesting. I feel like I spent a long time working as a child and youth counselor and got to work in
Mm.
group homes quite a bit of time. And I always find it fascinating how we kind of make an assumption like, go, like, hey, got to go to the store and get groceries. But for somebody who hasn't yet developed some of those skills, there's so many steps in between getting to here to going to the grocery store to getting the things on the list to checking out and using money and not giving too much money or like all of the different things. So I really, really appreciate that. That's like the context you come from. I think that's really, really interesting.
Yeah, yeah, it's very fulfilling work and it really does make you think like these life skills we assume that they're inherent but they have to be taught at some point and it's really enriching to be able to have be that person in someone's life.
And so you did that, and then you've spent a lot of time, I guess, in the research space. And then now you're sort of moving that focus over into the counseling space.
Yeah, definitely. So I do clinical work. So I do have my caseload with my two practicums currently, but then I also have my research work on the side as well. I think a big thing when it comes to counseling psychology is being able to balance your clinical work with your research work. And I'm fortunate enough to have a passion in both. So it works out well for me. A lot of work, but fulfilling work.
And so is that double rainbow? Is that what I was reading up on?
Yeah, so that was my master's lab. So for my master's degree, I worked with Dr. Meredith Maroney. I'm currently working with Dr. Ty Micasso, and they have a very similar lab. It's called the iReach lab, where we focus on LGBTQ identities, of course, but also other intersections with race and sex therapy and that kind of stuff. So a lot of really good and important work being done there too.
Amazing. Well, I really appreciate that and really cool to learn more about the awesome work that you do. Today, we're going to be talking about LGBTQ plus affirming care. There's a lot of people in my community who I know like really struggle. Like they might have had a bad experience once and it's hard to get back and rebuild that trust. So today I really want to dive into some basic questions around affirming care, but also really like talking about stigma and breaking that down a little bit. So I'm glad I get to do that today. So first, what is LGBTQ plus affirming care? When somebody says that they have an affirming practice, what does that mean?
Yeah, and I think it's important to be able to peg down what that means so you know what you're getting into when you enter the counseling space or whatever provider you're accessing. In terms of being LGBTQ affirming, it's basically to be the opposite of what we might know as reparative or conversion therapy, where someone's gender or sexual identity is seen as bad and something that needs to be fixed. To be LGBTQ affirming in the therapy space means that you are, well, affirming of those identities, you're validating them, you're accepting them. And in that case, it might not be working with LGBTQ clients specifically on issues related to sexuality and gender identity, though that certainly can come up. But it's also just being affirming while they bring up other things in their life. They might be struggling with work, they might be struggling with family, things that might not relate to their LGBTQ identity. Ultimately, at the end of the day, LGBTQ affirming therapy is something that you should have in all components of your work, not necessarily just working with LGBTQ clients specifically.
Super interesting. So we sort of broke that down into two different kinds of big issues that might come up.
Mhm.
There's the gender and sexuality components as sort of one chunk, and then there's all of the other things that might happen as well. What are some specific issues around gender and sexuality that might come up in therapy? What's a therapist's approach to supporting those who might be exploring coming out, might be exploring their gender a little more?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, the biggest thing I can think of is in terms of discrimination, being trans, being queer in general, there is a lot of stigma depending on where you are in the world. I like to say that we have made some strides, but acknowledging that that's might be a component that your client comes in with, especially if they may have non-affirming family members who could have rejected them. So that's something to understand in terms of just the context that your client's coming in. And then in terms of other presenting concerns, especially with gender identity, I find with that one, a really powerful question to ask your clients is, what does your gender identity mean to you then? Because a lot of clients, they may come in being like, I know that there's something going on, but I'm not quite sure where I lie in terms of a label. And maybe they don't feel like they need a label either. So a lot of identity exploring and then also acknowledging the stigma that they may face on a day-to-day basis are really two important things to keep in mind when they come into your office.
So that's really, really great. So tell me a bit about what that stigma might look like for these individuals in that community.
Yeah, definitely. So there are the more obvious looking aggressions that could be bullying, physical bullying, verbal bullying, harassment, that kind of thing, specifically related to gender identity or sexuality. But it can also be something more subtle too, just like being outcasted, being having that feeling that you don't belong with your peers, your family, that kind of thing. So in terms of the stigma, it can exist in multiple ways interpersonally, but there's also structural stigma too, just in terms of barriers that LGBTQ plus people have to face when accessing, let's say, benefits for their partner. That's a structural barrier and discrimination if you have a same-sex partner, and something that, we've worked really hard to address, but those structural limitations and barriers are still there.
So does that mean, like, let's say, like, one partner is a full-time employee, they're trying to help their partner access benefits, but if they're same sex, then that might not actually be applicable in that form.
Yeah, and I don't wanna say that that's like a widespread, like every company has that issue, but it's definitely one of the challenges on a systemic level that LGBTQ individuals have had to face and sometimes are still facing depending on where they're at in the world right now.
Really interesting. So I guess, I don't know, I find Pride Month in Canada is in June, and every company is saying, we're an ally. That there's a few famous ads that kind of, don't quite tell the whole story, but show that they're trying to be an ally for that specific time. What are things that companies should be doing more often to actually be an ally and go beyond Pride Month and support, it could be their employees, but also the LGBTQ plus community as a whole?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it comes down to, talking the talk and walking the walk. You can make your logo rainbow, but what are you actually doing to support the community and in some cases your own employees? I think a really important thing is having a culture of awareness surrounding LGBTQ plus identities and discrimination they may face. Having that training, especially for higher ups to acknowledge when discrimination or bullying might be happening in the workplace is so important. And also just having non-discrimination clauses in your company to make sure that those employees are protected. Another thing too is just making sure that you're creating affirming spaces for your employees, regardless of identity, to just feel validated and safe no matter how they identify.
Awesome. And in the initial questions we were talking through, a lot of it's actually around therapy. And the reason I thought that organizational piece is also really important is what are all of these different systemic pieces that an individual is interfacing with, and being affirming, being an ally. It's really important to understand how that individual experiences all of these different places that might not actually, go the full way and walk the walk in being affirming. And I think it's up to, sounds like, therapists for sure, but also up to organizations themselves to sort of step it up in that way and go beyond just, having a rainbow logo for that month.
Definitely, yeah.
So back to therapy. How do experiences like coming out later in life or exploring gender or sexual identity as an older adult, like how does that impact families? How does that impact, all of the different pieces of, I guess that microsystem?
Yeah, definitely, and I think there's a lot to be said because now we're playing with the idea of context and culture, and really, if you're looking in Canada, Canada's gay rights movement overall. So, the environment that a 70-year-old queer person grew up in, well, that's gonna be a lot different than the environment that a 30-year-old grew up in. So, in terms of the messaging they were given, the representation that they were most likely not provided with, and the acceptance for queer identities, that's gonna be dramatically different, and really that's where these negative narratives surrounding their gender or sexual identity can become embedded in them. So that's an important thing to consider when someone's coming out or exploring sexuality and gender later in life. I think another important thing when it comes to coming out later in life is to acknowledge that these individuals, they might have already gone to therapy, like 20, 30 years ago, had a bad experience, and then said, okay, I'm good. Guess that's not for me. So I think us as therapists really have to go in there and be aware of the fact that they might have had some negative experiences. And sometimes they'll want to unpack that in therapy, sometimes they won't, but just an important piece of context there. And then I guess one other point I could think of is the fact that coming out later in life, these individuals, they might have already lived a full life where they had a family. They could have come out at 65 as a gay man, and now they have kids that they have to come out to, adult kids. They might still have their wife at that time, and navigating what does this mean now, co-parenting, our relationship now. So I think that's an important piece of context as well, is that usually that means that they've probably had to live a life that didn't really feel authentic to them, but now it's navigating being the authentic self while also navigating all these other pieces that you have of your life and trying to come to a come to a sense of peace with it.
And do you find your approach as a therapist changes when you're working with somebody who's at that stage in their life and exploring their identity in that way?
Yeah, I think in terms of understanding their experiences, a really important thing is to ask, like, well, what was that like for you growing up then? What messages did you receive? Who was in your circle? Who did you fear being rejected by? Are those people still in your life now? What does that look like? And I mean, I think that's also part of just collecting a really good intake in terms of understanding where your client's been and where they are now, because context is everything when it comes to working with your clients.
And I think that's a really great point. And I wonder, I know sometimes, like, let's say you're talking to a friend and, there might be a tough question that comes up and you might, withhold yourself from asking that question because it's a big question. But
Mhm.
as a therapist, as a counselor, part of your work is asking those big questions up front because it helps to create that safe space and get people in the same page and the
Mhm.
mindset to sort of approach those really big, challenging questions.
Yeah, and I like to say, like, even having a session with a client, sometimes I can do no interventions in the session, and I'm just listening to them, and they'll say, "Wow, it was really nice just to be able to talk and to get it out." Because when you think about the therapy space, it's quite unique that it's an hour dedicated to you and you telling your story and experiences and how it's affecting you in the present day.
Love that. So I'm out there, I'm on the internet, I'm running through a million Google searches, I'm chat GPTing, and I find 100 different therapists that I can go to in my area or virtually. How do
Mhm.
I know if a mental health provider, therapist is LGBTQ plus affirming? What are red flags to look out for?
Yeah, and I think the red flags might be an absence of green flags. It might be one of those instances. So I can tell you what to look for, and then, people can make their decisions based off that. In terms of where you are in the world, the other places may have more availability of it, but there are directories of LGBTQ affirming therapists and mental health professionals. If there was one in your area, that's great to look through. Another thing is you can figure out a lot before you enter the office door. And by that, I mean looking on their website, seeing if they have something mentioning that they're LGBTQ affirming. Maybe they have a page or maybe they have a rainbow logo in their on their profile. So those are things to look for in terms of just seeing if the space is going to feel safe. Once you're in the office or the waiting room, you can look for things like pride flags as well to see if are they acknowledging my identity here. That's a good indicator that this space might be safe for you. And then just lastly, and this one I would caution to only do it if you feel safe, but you can ask them straight up, are you LGBTQ affirming? Is this a good space for me? And like I said, I caution that one just because I know some people they might not feel comfortable doing so, but that's definitely an option too. So there's a lot of green flags for things that you can look out for.
And it starts with like the ther the therapy offices, if they
Mhm.
are affirming and you're
Mhm.
not doing these things, it's important to start doing these things because that's what helps to create a safe space. And I think those are some really great things to look out for. My last official question for today is: what advice would you give to LGBTQ plus adults who are seeking therapy for the first time but are nervous or hesitant due to some of those past experiences or stigma?
Yeah, I think first off, I always have to give kudos to anyone that's looking to get therapy because it takes a lot of courage and a lot of awareness to even get to that point. So first off, props to them for knowing that they need that support. One thing I would say is, yeah, looking for those green flags is super important, but also just be reminded that the metaphor I like to use is therapists are like shoes. You're not going to fit each one. So even if you find that the provider is affirming, but it's not a good match, you do have that freedom to look for another one that fits you on different levels. But I think doing your homework in terms of making sure that the space feels safe for you is a huge part in making sure that it's a fulfilling experience for you as well.
And just out of my own curiosity, what are some trends in this space that you're looking forward to in the next 5, 10 years, either in the research or in more of a practical sense?
So I think we're seeing a lot more in terms of competency training, and I'm really excited for that. Back when people were graduating earlier on, people who maybe got their degrees in the 90s, these things weren't accessible. So even someone they might want to be LGBTQ plus affirming, but they just don't know how. So I'm really excited to see the fact that there are professional development opportunities that are coming up in ensuring that the next generation of therapists are going to be mindful and respectful of gender identity and sexuality. And then just in terms of a research perspective, representation's super important and we're seeing more of that in the research. We're seeing, some really exciting initiatives, especially in Canadian universities of LGBTQ plus research. And I can't wait to see where that's gonna go in the next 10 years.
It's amazing. I'm looking forward to that too. Danielle, where can people learn more about you and your research and the work that you do?
Yeah, definitely. So checking me out on LinkedIn, I'm definitely there. I'm also on my lab's website, so the iReach Lab. There should be a profile there of me. But yeah, feel free. I'm always happy to talk to people and share my experiences and support them however I can. So be happy to talk with anyone interested.
Amazing. Well, Danielle, I want to thank you so much for being on the show, and we'll chat soon.